Hello and welcome to a very special book talk titled The Many Lives of Anne Frank, featuring author Ruth Franklin. Thank you everyone for being here, those who are joining us today and those viewing this recording. I'm grateful to see so many new and familiar faces. And as always, I got to give a loving shout out to my amazing parents. And a very special thank you to all of our guest speakers and presenters, especially today's guest, author Ruth Franklin, who I'll be introducing to you momentarily. We also have a few survivors here with us today, so I want to give a shout out. I see Evelyn Appel, so hello. And if anybody wants to write in the chat where they're coming in from, you're welcome to do that. It's always good to know where people are zooming in from. One more shout out that I want to give is to our amazing allies, those who may not identify as Jewish, but certainly have Jewish neshamas, Jewish souls. Those who put so much on the line to fight for the Jewish people, often when we are too scared or too silent, we're fighting amongst ourselves. Some are on this Zoom right now and have been so supportive of these programs in our community, and sometimes they feel alone too, alienated because of their support of us. I have to say thank you to them. You mean so much to me in our community. My name is Michael Mantel. I'm a psychotherapist, educator, and 3G, the grandchild of Holocaust survivors, Mickey Mendelovich from Sighet, Romania, and Alice Diamond from Satmar, Romania. In their memories and to combat Jew hatred and Holocaust denial and distortions, I began hosting and producing these programs. In October 2020, with the help of Andrea Bolander, I launched the Sundays with Survivors program, the first of which featured Holocaust survivor Irving Roth of blessed memory. Thank God that program was successful because of Irving, Andrea, and everyone who attended and supported these efforts. We added more Holocaust education programs, including Mondays Among the Nations, 2G Tuesdays, and 3G Thursdays, because I love alliteration. They featured non-Jewish allies and children and grandchildren of survivors. And I continued adding more programs that cultivate Jewish pride and combat Jew hatred, both on and off college campuses. And I'm so grateful and proud to say that we are going over 4.5 years strong and counting. Now to introduce Ruth. Ruth Franklin is the incredibly talented writer and author of The Many Lives of Anne Frank, her most recent book, which was published by Yale University Press in January 2025. Ruth, congratulations on this new book. Ruth is also the author of Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life, winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award for biography, and 1,000 Darknesses, Lies and Truth in Holocaust Fiction, a finalist for the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Writing. Her criticism and essays appear in many publications, including The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The New York Review of Books, and Harper's. Ruth's book, The Many Lives of Anne Frank, has been described as an innovative biography, comprehensively researched and experimental in spirit. In it, Ruth explores the transformation of Anne Frank from an ordinary teenager to an icon, shedding new light on the young woman whose diary, now translated into more than 70 languages, is the most widely read work of literature to arise from the Holocaust. Ruth's book chronicles and interprets Anne's life, while also telling the story of the diary, its multiple drafts, its discovery, its reception, and its message for the world today. Writing alongside Anne, rather than over her, Ruth explores the day-to-day perils of the Holocaust in the Netherlands, as well as Anne's ultimate fate, restoring her humanity and agency in all their messiness, heroism, and complexity. Throughout today's program, we invite you to write your questions and comments in the chat, and at the end, we will open up the program for Q&A. No matter how incredible these programs are, and thank God they always are, your participation at the end adds so much more meaning and value. At that time, please feel free to raise your virtual hand using the hand raise emoji for me to see and call on you, or unmute yourself to ask your questions directly, or I can share your questions and comments that you have written in the chat. When you do write in the chat, please let me know if you want me to read it for you or if you would like to read it when the time comes. With all of that, I'd like to once again thank you all for being here and your continued support of these programs. And again, thank and welcome Ruth Franklin.
Thanks so much, Michael. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for all the wonderful work you do to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive. I also am a 3G, and it's powerful to hear you speak about it in this way. And thanks to all of you for being here. I see some familiar names and faces out there, which is always really nice to see. And for the many of you who I don't know, thank you for being interested in my work and being here. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what drew me to Anne Frank as a subject, how I put this book together in the way that I did, and what are some of the common myths and misconceptions about Anne Frank that I'm hoping that my work will dispel or correct. And along the way, I'm going to read a couple of brief selections from the book so that you have a little taste of the experience of reading it. And then Michael and I are going to talk a little bit, and then we'll open it up to your questions. So, the first question, the most obvious question here is, why write another book about Anne Frank? The shelves behind me, this is my home office. These shelves are filled with books about Anne Frank. She is, certainly the best known victim of the Holocaust. Her diary exists in about more than 30 million copies in print in more than 70 languages. Just about everybody knows the story of Anne Frank. Why does the world need another book about her? And I started in this project, of course, with that sense of Anne Frank as an icon. Certainly when I was growing up in the 1980s, her diary was absolutely required reading, for all adolescents, really, but of course, especially for Jewish girls. And I think for so many of us, she kind of gave permission to be a writer, for the idea that one's voice could be taken seriously as a teenage girl. And of course, also she attained that iconicity for the power of what she has to say, for narrating the story of her own persecution. Um, so, I knew of Anne Frank as this already canonical figure. Her face is on billboards, her image is in sculpture gardens around the world. But it wasn't until a bit later, I would say, in the 90s, when I was in graduate school, I started to hear for the first time about the different versions of Anne's diary that were out there. The idea that, once in a while, missing pages from the diary would resurface or be rediscovered. And this was front page news around the world, which, of course, just emphasizes the extent to which she remains this pivotal figure for so many people. And I started really wanting to understand, what was the story here? Why were there multiple versions of Anne's diary? What did this mean? How do we understand this? And so the goal of my book really was to put those two things together, to investigate her as an icon, to try to understand why and how her story has been so uniquely meaningful for so many people around the world in all kinds of different situations, globally, different political climates, different eras, but also to have a sense of who was the girl or the young woman behind this text, who is the real person who created this book. And I kept having the sense that the more that Anne becomes an icon, the less we actually understand of who she really was as a human being. And it's that goal that my book really, really seeks to investigate, is who she was and how she came to create this extraordinary book. And so, my book is not a conventional biography. As Michael said in his introduction, it was always my goal to write alongside Anne rather than over her. And this idea came to me in the beginning of my writing process before I even really understood what that meant. But I knew that it was important, on the one hand, I wanted to kind of flesh out the story of Anne's life. Of course, she narrates she narrates her interiority so beautifully in the diary that it almost feels like there couldn't be anything more to say about her life. But at the same time, she can only give us her story from her own perspective. And I wanted to look at her in an almost kaleidoscopic or panoramic way. I pictured myself sort of walking around her and looking at her from all different perspectives. And that meant doing a lot of research on, for instance, the history of the Netherlands during the war years, the history of the Holocaust in the Netherlands, and exactly how it unfolded there, which was quite different from the way the Holocaust happened in Eastern Europe, for instance. And to bring into Anne's story elements of the historical elements that affected her, that in fact decisions people made that, had a catastrophic effect on her life, but which she wasn't aware of at the time. So, to flesh out that story, I read many, many testimonies of other Jews in her situation, young Jewish people persecuted by the Nazis, especially Dutch Jews, other people who were in hiding, again, to try to flesh out our sense of what might have happened to her. And of course, many, many testimonies of people who were imprisoned in the same concentration camps as she was, Westerbork, Auschwitz, and finally Bergen-Belsen. And the story I hope to tell there is a story especially about what happened to women in those camps, especially Auschwitz, which is, I think, again, many of us think we know the story of Auschwitz. We know the story of these camps. And one thing I learned from reading these memoirs was that the Nazis persecuted women in a somewhat different way than they persecuted men, and that the experience of women in these camps was, again, just a little bit different than it was for men. So my goal was to really flesh out Anne's life from these many different perspectives. And to give you a little taste for how I try to do this, I'm going to read a very short section from early on in the book that describes what happened, the event that happened to trigger the Franks going into hiding. What happened was that Anne's sister, Margot, received a call-up notice from the Nazis. This takes place in July 1942. The Nazis occupied the Netherlands in May 1940. And for the first year or so, the persecution was very gradual, almost subtle, kind of a creeping creeping limitations on, rights and privileges, like being able to go to movies, being able to go shopping at certain hours of the day, being able to use public transportation, for instance. And then starting around spring 1942, the measures quickly became much more severe. And there were rumors that the Nazis were very soon going to begin with this mass deportation of Jews, starting with Jews like Anne's family, who were German Jewish refugees in the Netherlands. So I'm going to read a little bit of this scene when they get the call-up notice. And at this point, Otto Frank has been preparing for the family to go into hiding for about a year, hearing these rumors, having a sense of what might be about to happen, but they haven't actually decided to take that step yet. July 5th, 1942, 3 p.m. The doorbell rings. Anne is expecting her new boyfriend, Hello Silverberg. They've already spent the morning together sitting in the sun. The parks may be off limits, but Anne's apartment has a balcony. Like her, Hello was born in Germany. His real name is Helmut, but he's been living in Amsterdam with his grandparents since 1938, after his father's clothing store was destroyed during Kristallnacht. He's 16, and at first he preferred Margot, Anne's sister, but she was completely unapproachable. When he met Anne at a friend's house, she made an impression on him, despite being 3 years younger. Quickly, he became fascinated with her. The two of them have been going out only for a week or so, but they've spent a lot of time together. He walks her to the Jewish Lyceum in the mornings. After school, they go to the Oasis ice cream parlor or hang out at each other's homes. They speak Dutch together, not German. He loves to hear her talk. She asks him about his family, how he came to the Netherlands, what happened to his parents. They fled to Belgium. He's had barely any contact with them for 4 years. His grandmother thinks Anne is too young for him, but he doesn't care. Like many Jewish teenagers in their circles, he also goes to meetings of a Zionist club. His grandparents don't approve of that either, so he's used to asserting himself. Perhaps this is part of what Anne finds attractive in him. Or perhaps it's just that he's older and clearly interested in her. But it's not Hello at the door. A man's voice calls, Miss Margot Frank. Edith, their mother, goes down to answer. The man gives her an envelope containing a single sheet of paper. At the top, in large capital letters, it reads, "Summons. You are hereby ordered to participate in the police-supervised work relief program currently taking place in Germany and are therefore to appear on July 15th, 1942 at 1:50 a.m. at Amsterdam Central Station. The following may be taken as baggage: one valise or rucksack, one pair of work boots, two pairs of stockings, two pairs of underpants, one pair of overalls, one bowl, one drinking cup, one spoon, and one cardigan. Should you fail to give heed to this summons, you'll be punished with measures to be taken by the Sicherheitspolizei." Impossible to imagine what goes through Edith's mind at this moment. Mummy was terribly upset. Otto is out visiting residents at a home for elderly Jews. Edith leaves the girls together in the apartment and returns with a family friend. Anne is told that the summons is for Otto, not Margot. Considering how close Anne is to her father, it is not clear why Edith thinks she will find this less frightening. Of course, I started to cry terribly. The doors are locked. The Franks prepare to go into hiding immediately. Anne finds an excuse to drop off a few things with the neighbor's daughter: a book, a tin of marbles, a tea set. She will not say goodbye to Hello. And so what I've tried to do there, as I hope you can hear, is to bring together other voices that appear in the book alongside Anne's. The voice of this guy, Hello Silverberg, for instance, who did survive the war. Later was interviewed, he survived the war, he settled in Florida, and later was interviewed by a journalist about his relationship, his relationship with Anne, his appearance in her diary. The document of the call-up notice, which I found and had translated so that I could use it in this book, so that we can have a sense of exactly what the communications were like, what it might have been like to receive a letter like this from the occupying powers. Of course, the fact that they call it, for instance, they call it the police supervised work relief program currently taking place in Germany. The Dutch Jews at the time didn't know what this meant. They did not know that this was code for deportation to Auschwitz. But they did have a sense that whoever got on these trains would not be heard from again. And so that's why Jews who had enough foresight, who had the financial ability, who had friends to sustain them, managed to go into hiding like the Franks, a decision that managed to save their lives for so long. And of course, in this segment, you also hear Anne's voice in a couple of those lines from the diary. And those are interspersed throughout my books. Throughout my book, they're set off in italics rather than quotation marks, just because I wanted to give a sense of how special those words are, how special this document is, that she has a special place in this text. I'm going to read one other brief passage that describes the moment that Anne decided to rewrite her diary. I'll explain that a little bit more, but first, I want to read you the story. March 28th, 1944, day 632 in hiding. The Annex 8, that's my name for the 8 residents of the Annex. The Annex 8 are listening to Radio Orange, the broadcast service of the Dutch government in exile in London. They used to listen to the evening news down in the office after the employees had gone home. But after a spate of burglaries, they no longer leave their quarters at night. Instead, they all crowd around the table in the Annex kitchen and living room, which is at night the Van Pels' bedroom. At around 7:30 p.m., Gerrit Bolkestein, Minister of Education, Arts and Sciences, comes on to make a special address announcing the planned creation of a national archive of material relating to the war years. "My fellow countrymen," Bolkestein begins, "I believe I am expressing what many among you must be feeling when I say that the struggle and suffering of our people since May 10th, 1940, constitutes a period of crisis in our existence as an independent nation. A crisis comparable in its significance only to those years in the 16th century when our people fought for and established that nation's independence." When Bolkestein says "our people," It's doubtful he means Dutch Jews, although Jews seeking refuge from persecution in Spain and Portugal had already begun to arrive in the Netherlands by the late 16th century, attracted by the promise of a nation with freedom of religious practice. Still, those inclusive words must cheer the hearts of his listeners in the annex, especially Anne, who hopes after the war to become a Dutch citizen. As Jewish refugees from Germany, her family has been officially stateless ever since Hitler's invasion of the Netherlands. But consider how poorly and how incompletely we are informed about the 80 Years' War, Bolkestein continues. How painful the realization that we must do without, to take only a single example, the diary of an average citizen from the days of the siege and liberation of Leiden. Are those the words that pique Anne's attention? After the war, Bolkestein continues, the government plans to establish a national center to collect, edit, and publish all historical material relating to these years. Personal documents, as well as copies of Dutch underground magazines, records of the resistance, and so forth. Bolkestein acknowledges that some citizens might wish to keep their papers private. But in order for this center to become a truly national institution, all possible materials must be gathered in one place. That is why I am calling on all listeners, he says. History cannot be written on the basis of official decisions and documents alone. If our descendants are to understand fully what we as a nation have had to endure and overcome during these years, then what we really need are ordinary documents, a diary. Imagine Anne hearing these words. Nearly 15 years old, she is no longer the short, skinny girl with shiny black hair and rather sharp features, whom Jacqueline van Marzen, her best friend, remembered from the Jewish Lyceum, whose schoolgirl photo, her hair tucked behind her right ear, her eyes gazing upward, her mouth serious, would become an unlikely icon. She now stands 5 feet 6 inches tall, with breasts and hips that long ago burst the seams of the clothes in which she arrived at the annex. Miep, Otto's secretary, who sustained them in hiding. Miep later recalled that she was spontaneous and still childish sometimes, but she had gradually acquired a new coyness and a new maturity. She had arrived a girl, but she would leave a woman. Of course, they all made a rush at my diary immediately, Anne records the next day. Her thoughts go immediately to its revision as a romance, that is to say, a novel, of the secret annex, although she worries that people will think that it's a detective story. But seriously, it would be quite funny 10 years after the war if people were told how we Jews lived and what we ate and talked about here. If people were told, that's version A, the original version, the rough draft of Anne's diary. Returning to it a few months later, Anne makes a small but significant revision. But seriously, it would be quite funny 10 years after the war if we Jews were to tell how we lived and what we ate and talked about here. The story of persecution can't be told by others. Those who lived it need to tell it themselves. And that's the realization in my reading, that's the realization Anne had that made her go back to the beginning and rewrite, revise her diary from the start. She transformed it from a personal, private document that, had all kinds of stuff that didn't wind up in the published version, gossip about her schoolmates or her daydreams. She took this private document and she made it into a public text of persecution that could go in this National Archive and tell the story to the world of what happened to the Jews of the Netherlands. And for that reason, I think this really is the biggest misconception about Anne Frank, is that she was just a girl who wrote a diary that in many cases, by many critics and historians, has been regarded as a kind of found object, a work of found art. My book tries to make the case that it wasn't that at all, that to imagine that is really to do Anne a great disservice and to restore to her the agency that she deserves in taking this material, this rough material, and transforming it into a work of testimony that would endure for the next 80 decades and most likely much more. So with that, Michael, I'll turn it over to you. I'm sure you have questions, and yeah, let's get started.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Incredible introduction to your book. I have the book right here. I recommend it to everybody. I said to Ruth that I read it, and it was incredible. That I learned so much about Anne and her family that I didn't know. You take for granted. You think you know this person, and you really don't know anything. And then also the story of the Jews in the Netherlands. I was shocked by how much I didn't know, also because her story is one of the maybe the only ones that people hear about, but it's not common, as you said or
Yeah,
suggested.
an exception. But yeah, I was really shocked too working on this book. Really, I was learning new things every single day. There's just so much to learn about the Holocaust.
So what was that like for you? You read it as a child. I think you visited the Anne Frank house, the museum, when you were younger, but now returning to this as an adult, as a mother, and as an author. What was that like, and like learning all of these revelations or discoveries?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the biggest change for me was, I think, as you know, as I write a little bit about in the book, it's so different to read the diary as an adult and especially as a parent than it is to read it as a child. You know, when you're a child, you want to identify with Anne, but as a parent, you read it and you can't help but identify with Otto, her father, who experienced this incredible tragedy and trauma. He was the only one of the 8 residents of the annex to survive. He survived Auschwitz and made his way back to Amsterdam. And eventually, when it became clear that Anne and Margot had both died in Bergen-Belsen, his secretary, Miep Gaze, who had collected the pages of Anne's diary off the floor in the annex after the Gestapo raided it and had been keeping them all this time, she presented him with this pile of papers and said, "This is your daughter's legacy to you." And, looking back on that historically, it's so extraordinary that this document survived and made its way to us. But, it's not an accident that it made its way to us in the form that it was in. And Otto, by so many readers and critics, Otto has been kind of vilified as Anne's censor. There's this kind of general perception that he censored her criticisms of her mother or her thoughts about her body, her developing sexuality. And this just isn't true. And not only is it not true, but all readers, all of us who read the diary, in the original form in which it was published in English, which, if you read the diary in English before the late 90s, you read it in Otto's edit. And so you know that that's not true. All of that stuff is in that version. And instead, Otto, I think, really deserves to be celebrated for the remarkable work he did of taking both Anne's edit and the original material that she had left behind and putting them together in this remarkable text.
Yeah, I found it, as you said, remarkable. For me, the story of Anne Frank and the family ended when the diary ended, and then of course I know a little bit more of her story in concentration camps and in transit. But you reveal to your readers so much that I think so many of us didn't know, and it really talking about like feeling the sense of Otto being a human being and identifying with him if you're reading it as an adult, but reading about the trials and tribulations, first learning about the diary, learning that his daughters didn't survive, and then taking this idea and trying to have it published. And then it's turning into a Broadway show and a movie. So I just found it remarkable what he went through
Right.
with.
It seems so obvious to us that, of course, the Diary of Anne Frank would be published. Who wouldn't want to read this? But at the time, Otto actually was up against a lot of naysayers who people literally said to them, who is going to read this book? And there was not much precedent for publishing the diary of a girl like this. And I give him a lot of credit. He really, truly, he was a visionary in seeing, not only that he had this extraordinary work on his hands, but also I believe that he had a vision of what the diary could be. He really felt that it could be kind of a beacon to go out into the world and serve as a book that promoted peace and tolerance. And in many ways, it did exactly that.
Can you talk a little bit more about Otto coming to learn about the diary, accepting that, and a little bit more in depth about what it was like going through that process. As you said, it seems obvious that this diary would have become published and would have been a success, but it seems like it might have not been at first, and then the reception in the United States and around the world was different. Can you talk a little bit
That's
more about
right.
what it was
Yeah.
like?
So, the diary is published kind of quietly in the Netherlands, also in Germany and France. And it was in the French translation that a young editor at Doubleday named Judith Bailey, later who would become famous as Judith Jones, a very famous editor of cookbooks, including Julia Child's. She picked it up out of the slush pile. Her boss had given it to her to reject, and she picked it up and was drawn in by Anne's picture on the cover. And by this, she said she started reading it and couldn't put it down. And she told her boss that he had to send it on to the New York office, which a decision that he later, by the way, was all too happy to take credit for. And once it got there and they decided to publish it, it was another young woman editor. This one, Barbara Zimmerman, who her married name was Barbara Epstein, and she became one of the co-founders of the New York Review of Books eventually. But this was literally her first job, other than being a summer camp counselor. Her first job in publishing was to publish the Diary of Anne Frank. And people have speculated that the fact that Doubleday gave this book to somebody who is so junior just shows how little they expected from it. And in fact, the advertising budget for the diary was zero. They were not planning to promote the book. And Barbara Zimmerman, basically all on her own, organized this incredible publicity push. For one thing, she got Eleanor Roosevelt to sign the introduction that appeared in the book. Barbara actually wrote it herself, but she got Eleanor Roosevelt to lend her name to it, which obviously gave the book so much authority. And then she engineered a cover review for the book on the New York Times Book Review, written by none other than Meyer Levin, a playwright and journalist, an American Jewish playwright and journalist, who later, very soon, was going to become embroiled with Otto in the controversy over the Broadway adaptation of the book. This is so ironic because Meyer Levin eventually is going to actually sue Otto Frank for having denied him the right to adapt the diary into a Broadway play. In fact, Levin was allowed, what did take, he took a shot at it and produced a draft that Otto rejected as being too Jewish. And they go back and forth in these remarkable letters. They go back and forth over how the diary and how Anne should be portrayed for an American audience. And Otto at one point literally says to him, "This is not a Jewish book, so don't make a Jewish play out of it." He truly saw the diary as a universal book, a book and as a universal figure of teenagers, of kind of young adulthood, adolescence. As that is her identity before being a Jew is her identity. And then at the same time, in the same letter, just a few lines later, Otto says to Levin, but at the same time, it has to be a Jewish play so that it can work against anti-Semitism. And this, is the tension that the diary has found itself caught up in from the beginning. On the one hand, it is a universal text. So people around the world find it so relatable. And one of the things I did in my research was to collect the stories of different people around the world who were affected by the diary in interesting ways. From a young man from Eritrea in an Ethiopian refugee camp who decides to translate the diary into his native Eritrean language, to different actors and musicians who were inspired by it to create works of art. It's had this universal impact. But at the same time, the fact that it can have this universal impact, at least as Otto and others saw it at the time, that it can have that impact only by downplaying Anne's Jewishness and emphasizing the extent to which she is, kind of an every girl, is itself a sign of this lurking anti-Semitism that, is always, not even in the background of the diary. It's an in inseparable part of the diary story.
I found that also incredible. Number one, how Otto was the one who initially was ambivalent about whether the Broadway play itself should be seen as a Jewish play or be more universal on this particular versus the universal. I think that's a conflict or question that we have in Holocaust education. It's always never again or never again for anyone. And how do we get the lessons out there for people? And I think you said there were a couple of things that I just found. Again, I'll just keep on saying over and over, people should get this book because it's incredible, this behind the scenes, what happened to get the book published itself, the diary, and then the play, and then the movie, and then how Anne Frank essentially became this symbol or figure to others, and they could or would potentially strip her identity as a Jewish person, etc., and use her image or her name or her story for their own desires. So I mean, one of the lives that I guess that you share is Anne as a pawn. Um, can you talk a little bit more about that? I found it so fascinating, and it speaks to me because I've been seeing her image used, particularly by some who might be considered anti-Semitic or some anti-Israel or anti-Zionist, but also in other spaces as well. I've seen also the yellow star being used or misused or appropriated for other causes. So if you can share a little bit about that, because I know you also talk about that in the book, and then you also share your feelings about, extracting her Jewishness from the story.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that just really bedeviled me throughout the research and writing of the book. I was, for several years, I had this Google alert set up for Anne Frank. And so it would return, regularly all these different mentions of her in all kinds of different contexts as you bring up. There's the restaurant that gets in trouble for having an Anne Frankfurter on its menu and all kinds of other stuff. But of course, we also see the way in which her name is invoked in all kinds of political contexts, from Greta Thunberg and climate change to, apartheid in South Africa, to the crisis over Syrian migrants in the later 20 teens. And then, of course, to anti-Zionism, there's this image that regularly circulates of Anne wearing a keffiyeh, presumably in favor of the Palestinian cause. And, I tried hard to sort these things out. I wouldn't say that I, in the end, come to some kind of conclusion about it because I think that it's so circumstantial and we have to kind of take each case in detail for what it does and doesn't do. And in the end, I keep coming back to the same tension that there's something so powerful in Anne's story and in the story of the Holocaust in general, right? You raised the question of, should our Holocaust museums, be focused on the Holocaust, or should they be about genocide in a larger sense, right? Which has been part of the story of the United States Holocaust Museum from the very beginning, when it opened during the reports of genocide in Bosnia, and that became a part of the museum's narrative. So, is it possible to understand the story in a universal way and yet have it retain its Jewish character so that it can still be a Holocaust story? And, where I come down in the end is that that has to be possible, that we have to be able to hold those two ideas in our head at the same time. One of the more interesting cases of it that I came upon while researching the book was there's this interesting production of the Diary of Anne Frank called The Diary of Anne Frank Latinx, done with all Latino actors as a more or less explicit comment on the immigration, the migrant crisis. This was during the first Trump administration. And I decided I wanted to see this production. I wanted to see a production of The Diary of Anne Frank while I was working on this book. It seemed like, that was really necessary, and, why not this one? And it was both more moving and less kind of politically jarring than I had expected it to be. It was in fact done in a very sensitive and and I thought thoughtful way. And then at the end of the session of the production that I saw, there was a Q&A with the actors, and a woman in the audience stood up and said the question that was surely on everybody's mind, which was, "Isn't this appropriation?" And she really was shouted down by people, other people in the audience, by some of the actors who pointed out that, in fact, the actor who played the figure of Peter's father, Mr. Van Pels, in the play is called Mr. Van Dam, was actually had Jewish origin. It came from Argentina. His grandfather, I guess, had been a refugee who came to Argentina. And so, if it's okay with him, then why shouldn't it be okay with us? And, this is an argument from identity that I think never feels very satisfying, or, is not a particularly thoughtful one. Um, in the end, I do believe that it's an anti-Semitic impulse to say that the story of Anne can't be relatable unless it somehow transcends her Jewishness. Because then what we're saying is that a Jew cannot be universal. They will always they will always first and foremost be a Jew, which is something that Anne herself laments in her diary. And yet, at the same time, if this story can be used to promote tolerance, as Otto always hoped it would be, and as I think Anne also hoped that it would eventually be, then don't we have an obligation to try to see commonalities and create that kind of empathy across cultures?
Thank you for that answer. This is an incredible talk. I want to open it up to everyone here. If you would, we do have a few questions in the chat, and if you were shared with me. I want to ask if you want to raise your virtual hand using the hand raise emoji. You can do that, and I'll call on you. You can also unmute yourself if you have a question or comment, or again, you can add your questions or comments in the chat. I see Lauren had a question.
Comments in the chat about how women were treated in concentration camps. I want to say I don't want to go into it in great detail here. There are a couple chapters in the book about it. The one thing I'll say is that women were subjected to violence because of their gender, including sexual violence, in a way that is still kind of taboo to talk about. One almost never hears that talked about. But rape and pregnancy were a reality of life in the camps for many women. And then there's also one, kind of smaller way in which women were persecuted in a different way from men, which was in the question of their clothes. We have this image in our mind of the Auschwitz inmate as a man wearing a striped uniform, as the popular book has it, the boy in striped pajamas. And this image is so pervasive that I was quite surprised to learn that women inmates didn't wear these uniforms. They were given ordinary clothes to wear. But that, as everything with the Nazis, became its own kind of torture because they were given all kinds of clothes to wear that were not appropriate for the climate or, the environment. And so you had women who were given these revealing dresses to wear that, didn't cover them up and that brought sexual attention to them, but also, didn't give them any warmth. Women who were given high heels to put on in the camp. And this is just one. Again, I'm puzzled that these kinds of details about women's experience in the camp are not better known. Okay, I will let you continue with your
Yeah,
moderation of the questions.
Lauren has a really wonderful question.
Yes. Is it okay if I just kind of read what I typed into the chat?
Sure, that's totally fine.
Okay, sure. So my question is, do you agree with the Dara Horn critique that Anne's diary skews popular understanding of the Holocaust because it doesn't and really cannot reveal the extent of the brutality of Nazism? And then I had kind of like a secondary question, which is, do you think the diary advances the value of allyship for persecuted minorities, being that this diary is only made possible by the allies, the non-Jewish allies who are supporting the Franks and recovering Anne's papers after her murder?
Yeah, that's a great point. I'll just address the second part of that first. Yes, I think, throughout the diary, we see Anne, over and over thanking, expressing her gratitude to these allies. Some of us may know the name of Mépris, Otto's secretary, but we generally don't know the names of the others, the other former employees of his who were so instrumental. There were, in the end, 6, 7, 8 people in sort of the larger circle, these tight-knit employees, but then also their spouses or their friends were in on it and also helped out. And, this was an extraordinary situation for Dutch Jews in hiding to have. The vast majority of Jews, well, first of all, the vast majority of Dutch Jews weren't able to go into hiding. Most of them were simply rounded up and deported. I believe I have the figures in my book, but I think it's around a quarter of the Jews were able to go into hiding. And they have a much higher survival rate than the Jews who were deported. But most of them were in much less fortunate circumstances. They might be moved around often from place to place and totally dependent on the kindness of whomever their hosts happened to be, versus Otto and the residents of the annex were lucky, comparatively, to have a lot of control over their space and to be to be sustained with food and companionship and books and entertainment by these people who cared so much about their well-being. And this is something that has also been kind of glossed over in the adaptations. There's been a lot of, controversy over the extent to which the Broadway play de-Judaizes Anne. But there's much less said over the way it downplays the role of these allies, and especially Meep. Also, there's one male figure in the play who stands in for 2 real life people, and we don't have any sense of all the people who are active behind the scenes. So, yes, certainly, if allyship is an important value to promote coming from the diary, there have been a lot of missed opportunities there. And so in terms of then the criticisms of the diary for not depicting the real brutality of the camps. This has been leveled at Anne by Holocaust scholars throughout the years. And, it seems somewhat unfair. It's not her fault that she had to leave her diary behind in the annex and couldn't chronicle all that. Quite seriously, I think, we can imagine what might have become of, what Anne might have become had she survived the camps. And people often wonder, well, would she still have published the diary? Would it still have had the impact that it had if she had been alive? Of course, we can't answer those questions. But what I really think, the book that I imagine is missing is that if Anne had survived Auschwitz, she might have written a testimony about that camp that we would now read alongside Night or, Survival in Auschwitz, or maybe instead of those books, right? And if that were true, then we'd all know about the women's experience in Auschwitz. Then it wouldn't be a surprise to us that they weren't given the regular camp uniforms. And so, I sometimes imagine the kind of book that Anne might have written about the camps that she'd been able to survive. And that's part of the reason it was so important to me in this book to really fully tell that story. There have been, many people have collected the testimonies of women who knew Anne in the camps. I saw someone in the chat mention a wonderful film by the Dutch documentary filmmaker Willy Lindver about Anne's last 7 months, which there's also a book that's a transcript of the film that I recommend to anybody who's interested in going into more depth. I quote from some of those testimonies in my book, and I also quote from other people who didn't necessarily know Anne, but other women who were in the camps alongside her at the same time, who were eyewitness accounts. We can imagine, again, we can't say for sure that this is true, but we can imagine that some of what these women saw at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen might have also been things that Anne saw.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And EJ, you had a question or comment as well?
Yeah, it's not necessarily a question, but more of well, first to just thank you both, Ruth, for just sharing your book, but also the knowledge with us and your point of view. I think it's good to sort of let us know it's not just what you're doing. It's not just giving us the family's point of view, but also your point of view. And I think that's quite important to have that as well. And of course, Michael, thank you for putting these together. I think what I want to say is actually something you had mentioned at the start when you talked about, oh, there's another Anne Frank book, or, you know, how do you get that? And it reminded me of something that's sort of the duality of life. And when I was quite young, I think I went to go see Europa. I was probably, 12 years old or something. And a friend had said to me, and my best friend at the time, who was also Jewish, and had, said, "What? There's so many films about the Holocaust and blah blah blah, and why are you watching yet another one?" And I felt really weird at that age to not be able to have an answer, and I just thought, well, it's something I want to know about. And I just felt quite clumsy. But then the question came up again, maybe like 6 or 7 years ago. And it was quite funny because it was the same sort of like, why do we have that? Why do we need to have so many movies about the Holocaust? And I think then for me, it was much more lucid, the answer. And, what I said to that person there was that, this was the first time that we saw sophistication in hatred and the complete wiping of people based solely on hatred, not religion, not because their religion said that is better. It was really because we went to see an entire race gone. And the way it was done was to sort of wipe these people off the face of the earth. And every story that we tell is a way of saying that they didn't succeed, and there could be 5 million books about Anne Frank, and yet we're still not going to get to the heart of why it's important to tell her story. I think we're going to keep finding nuggets around that. So I appreciate you doing that as well, and leading us there. And it made me think as well, when we talk about this, having so many films, so many books. I think there was something like only 8 years since the Holocaust has there not been an actual movie about the Holocaust. And yet when we watch these movies, there's still a freshness. There's still an idea of a perspective being told that needs to be shared. And so I think even though we're talking about the same person, we're still talking about different points of view, because we'll never have the opportunity to talk to her face to face and get to know what she really experienced, and to the other person who spoke before about the atrocity that she suffered. But I think to focus on the atrocity is to take away from the life that she lived and the life that she could have lived. So with that, I'll stop talking and just thank you again for contributing greatly to the canon.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great point. And of course, all major historical figures deserve to be looked at over and over again and reinterpreted from fresh perspectives. That we are always changing in the way we look at history and bringing new ideas to it.
And I think also the idea of, and like Ruth, how you say, like Anne, you're speaking alongside Anne and not, over her. And I think it's so important because often, especially if it was just a found object, a diary, then people might want to insert their thoughts. However, clearly she was editing it with the idea of publishing it, and her life cut short. She wasn't able to, and there's so much there. So I think, again, going with the edited versions, for example, that's one way that the story changes or we learn some more. But then there's also that part, and Ruth, you mentioned in your book, that's that famous line, "There's good in everyone." I can't remember exactly how the quote goes, but it's also the last. I guess it's how the play ends.
That's right. In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. Yeah, this line has been turned over a lot.
And I think that speaks to this in a way. At least that's the epitome of this for me is, the question, would she have still written that? And you ask that question in your book, and other people have answered it or attempted to answer it. I love that you don't, but you just pose that question, and it's for all of us to think. And we're not only thinking about it with Anne after, being in Auschwitz. Would she have changed that if she survived? Would she have changed that part and said, no, there isn't goodness in all of us, etc. Like, how would that change? But even as we read it today, knowing of everything that's been going on in the 80 years since the Holocaust, I think we ask that question also, and we're interpreting her diary and wondering, imposing our own thoughts on it.
Indeed. Yeah. So that line, has been the source of so much controversy. And I gave a talk to a rather conservative group of people, included a very Orthodox rabbi. And at the end of my talk, and the talk happened to be the day after the deaths of the Beavis children were announced. And I gave this little talk about Anne Frank, and afterwards the rabbi immediately said, "So you're going to tell me that the monster who murdered the Beavis children is really good at heart?" And, of course, I can't say that. And as you know, in the book, I don't pretend to speak for Anne Frank. There are many people who say with a great deal of confidence that an Anne who had experienced Auschwitz would not have been able to write these lines. And my own take is we don't know that. We don't know how she would have seen it. And I came, in fact, to view those lines a little bit differently after learning about the prisoners in South Africa who read her diary in prison, in isolation on Robben Island, including Nelson Mandela, and another man named Ahmed Kathrada, who also kept kind of a journal and wrote out quotes from Anne's diary in his own notebook. And one of the quotes that he chose was this one about how people are still good at heart. And of course, in the diary, there's also more context to it. She writes that she still believes that people are good at heart, but that she also sees the world being turned into a wilderness, and that the great storm is coming and it's going to swallow them too. It's a one beacon of light in a very negative passage about what's going on in the world. And I found it incredibly moving that these, anti-apartheid, pro-democracy activists in South Africa in those years found that line inspiring. And it struck me that, if you are someone like that, if you're trying to create a revolution, to revolutionize your society and build it up again from the ground, you have to believe that people are really good at heart, right? Because that's what the democratic system is founded on, is the belief that people are good and can be trusted to do the right thing. And putting it in that context helped me see it a little bit differently.
Yeah, I found that really beautiful. You share a little bit about that in your book and how it's an idea. It doesn't have to necessarily be true, but it's the hope that we have that
Right.
keeps us going for positive change, hopefully.
Right. It's actually a revolutionary statement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
A question that someone posed, and I'll sort of ask it as well because I had a similar question. Someone asked, what are your thoughts about the Anne Frank Museum in Amsterdam? And I know there's one that just opened here at the Center for Jewish History in New York City. So what are your thoughts about how those represent Holocaust education and the story of Jews in the Netherlands, or the story of the Holocaust? You talk a little bit about the Anne Frank Museum in your book, and whether or not people are able to learn the lessons from their visits. So maybe you can tie that into that question.
Yeah, I mean, that might be too much to ask of a museum, to be honest. But, I think I see that really as a kind of pilgrimage site. And one thing that was really fascinating to me to learn was that it became a site of pilgrimage kind of spontaneously. In the first years after the diary was published, people would just show up at the address, hoping to see Anne's hiding place, which, and, at that point, it was still Otto's workplace, and the employees who were there would sometimes show these tourists around if they had time. And it was Otto's dream to buy this building and turn it into what he imagined. He imagined it to be a kind of international youth center, with a youth hostel and meeting spaces and educational programs and stuff like that. Of course, it's become something quite different, but it was the proceeds from the Broadway play that allowed him to buy the building and renovate it. It actually was in danger of literally falling down. And if that Broadway play hadn't become the kind of success it was, we might not have an Anne Frank house now. So another really fascinating piece of that history, I think. From the beginning, that museum has, like Otto himself, has had a more universalist bent. It hosted exhibitions in the early years, comparing Nazism to apartheid in South Africa. It's become, as we know, it's now become an incredibly popular tourist site where, it's sort of a never-ending churn of visitors, literally every 15 minutes from 9 a.m. till 10 p.m. at night, 365 days a year. And, I do have a sense that, a lot of the visitors who come there aren't necessarily well-versed in Anne's diary. If you look at the guest books that visitors sign, their comments are often pretty insipid, as one might expect. And, if you look on Instagram, you'll see lots and lots of pictures of people posing outside the door, sort of pretending to be Anne Frank. But, in the end, I guess I have to be with Otto here and say that anything that raises the visibility of her story in the world is a good thing. That museum has made a deliberate decision to promote itself to the widest possible portion of humanity, to welcome as many people as possible, in the hope, I guess, that her story will remain important to some of them. As for the exhibition that's right now at the Center for Jewish History in New York, that's a very different situation in that, for the first time, somebody has tried to recreate the rooms of the annex in another location, and they furnished them with period pieces. Some of it is Frank family heirlooms that were preserved by Otto's family, who were Otto's mother and siblings, who were in Switzerland, who fled to Switzerland before the war broke out. So there, it's not the actual furniture and belongings that were in the annex. All of that stuff was lost, but it's things that, it's furniture similar to what they would have had and other similar objects. And the rooms are surrounded with quite a comprehensive exhibit about the Holocaust, not just in the Netherlands, but offering a kind of capsule history of the Holocaust across Europe and in Eastern Europe. It tries to do a lot. I think, it serves a very effective pedagogical purpose. I saw it and I wanted to bring my 9-year-old child to visit it, and it's become very, very popular with school groups. She then visited it again with her class. And I think it's providing a real service for people who don't have the opportunity to go to Amsterdam and experience the authentic annex in person, but still, get something that's a very vivid glimpse of what Anne's life might have been like.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it leads to people having a conversation. I think that's so important, and introducing young people, especially. I think it's a longer exhibit than I thought it was when I first heard about it. There's a lot of the history, and you're going through the actual exhibit, and then in the back there is this recreation of the rooms. However, I think just bringing hopefully younger people there could raise awareness, because clearly we're losing sight of Holocaust education and awareness in younger generations. But just like your book brings about so much more information and new questions. So just want to go through your book. You have a part 1 and a part 2. You have Anne Frank, it's part 1, and then Anne Frank in quotes in part 2, and it's the many lives. It's Anne Frank as child, refugee, target, witness, lover, artist, prisoner, and corpse. And then the quote unquote Anne Frank is the author, the celebrity, ambassador, the survivor, and the pawn. And I find it so remarkable taking people through so many different iterations or interpretations or misinterpretations of this human being. And I found that so fascinating. It was so beautiful. You opened my eyes to so much. You share so many different resources as well. And I put them in my Amazon cart ready to purchase, and a bunch of movies as well. It's pretty wonderful. And I know this book just came out, so it's kind of a silly question to ask, but do you have any thing that you're working on now, anything on the horizons that we should also look for, or where we can find more of your writings?
Thank you. I am kind of feeling my way towards a new project, but it's quite amorphous and not fully formed yet. But I encourage anybody who's interested in reading my writing on Anne Frank, or my writing about the process of writing biography, or also of writing criticism, which also is a major part of what I do. To look up my newsletter, which is on Substack. All my information is on my website, which is ruthfranklin.net. Very easy to find. And I do have a free Substack newsletter in which I post stuff about my process and the experience of writing this book.
I want to be mindful of time. I know there are more questions, but I think a lot of the questions that people ask can be answered from this book, and more questions will arise when people read the book. Again, it's so fascinating. You take the reader on a journey that I don't think anyone thought was possible. The story of Anne Frank I contained only to the diary, not even what happened after the diary. And then there's literally these other lives that you introduce the readers to that were so fascinating, and how the connection of the Broadway play, how that's connected, again, like you said, to the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam, needing the proceeds of the play, so needing that play to be produced, needed to succeed in order for this home to not be sold to someone else or to be torn down. So how all of these instances and concerns go through Otto, and he has to kind of explore this at every step, whether to have the book published, which iteration of the book, which editions. So I find the book so fascinating. It's so incredible. You add so much to the landscape and to the story. So thank you so much for that. Ruth, I just want to ask if you have any last words or anything that you want to share. And then I'll have a follow-up email that I'll send to everyone with your information as well, where we can find you.
No, thanks so much for being here, and thanks for so much for all of your interest and for these really engaged and interesting questions. Yeah, and I encourage anybody who would like to ask me a follow-up question individually. You can find my email, my contact information on my website, ruthfranklin.net. So feel free to reach out that way.
And I just want to say we didn't plan it, but Anne Frank's birthday would be tomorrow,
That's right.
June 12th. So it's kind of beautiful to have it on this day to commemorate her memory and life.
Yes.
So again, Ruth, thank you so much for joining us and sharing everything you've brought to this landscape, Holocaust education and awareness and literature. And everyone, thank you for being here. And I hope to see you at our next program. Take care, be well.
Bye, thank you.